I have to stop procrastinating. I have a commission to do and I've been avoiding it. It's not a hard design, but there's a few things getting in my way. For one, it's big. It's 36 by 36 inches, which means I need to rearrange my entire dining room to make space for it. Two, it's traditional. I typically do digital commissions, and most of the time it's pet portraits, so I have a clear reference to work with. This was a commission by someone I know quite well who said, and I quote, "You know my style," with nothing else to work off of. I managed to create some Pinterest boards and send some sketches for approval, but they basically put their faith in me, which meant I had to put my faith in me. And anyone who gets imposter syndrome knows that's not easy. Not to mention, there's no going back with acrylics. Third, it needed to be perfect. This isn't perfectionism entirely. It's more that this was for a company, so they wanted me to use the exact brand colors, which means there was no messing around with my color mixing skills. But eventually, all procrastination must come to an end, and you have to just start. So, let's stare this project down together and talk folklore. I'm thinking fairy trees. The end of William Allingham's 19th century poem, The Fairies, reads, "By the craggy hillside through the mosses bare, they have planted thorn trees for pleasure here and there. Is any man so daring as dig them up in spite, he shall find their sharpest thorns in his bed at night." A few years ago, we went to Ireland, and I'll admit, I clocked every adorned tree I could see. Some had small fences around the trunk, others white cloth hanging from the branches. Every tour guide talked about fairy trees or fairy rings, and there was a part of me that hoped to catch a glimpse of something in my periphery. The first time I heard about catching glimpses of the fae was from Charmed, where the sisters worried about in-between spaces like doorways or dusk. In Tithe by Holly Black, she writes of seeing through glamours with different tricks, including peripheral vision. Even when my rational brain rolls its eyes, there's that little voice in my head that whispers to check. Sometimes I see a glimmer in the corner of my eye and wonder. Though a friend of mine pointed out that's because evolutionarily our periphery is more sensitive to changes in light in order to detect predators, I pointed out the fae most certainly are predators. Since I was a little kid, I've always kept my eye out. Once, when I was really little, I was hiking with my dad and brother. We paused for snacks and I wandered down a stream. Close to the bottom of its path was a large boulder with a tree trunk that had grown nearly on top of it. The way they situated themselves together, a small section of rock protruded from the tree trunk and looked like a little door. I ran back up the stream and told my dad and brother I'd found an elf house. They misunderstood and thought I said an outhouse. There were a few minutes of complete confusion as they asked me repeatedly if I needed to go to the bathroom, but I finally managed to drag them down there and show them what I meant. Later, we came up with whole stories about who lived there and what their life was like. Sometimes it feels silly or childish to even tell these stories as if they have a sense of realism. I often fight the urge to minimize my love of folktales because of that. But being in Ireland and then a few years later Iceland, where stories like this are ingrained into generations, it actually felt refreshing. These stories aren't only about trees. There are also fairy rings, which are rings of white mushrooms found on forest floors, fairy forts, a collection of rocks that build small structures, and Icelandic elf rocks. It is said that these natural structures are used as doorways to the other worlds, or gathering places for the fae, sometimes even simply sacred to them. Whether they be rocks, mushrooms, or trees, we know one thing for sure. If they're associated with the fae, you leave them alone. Fairy trees, which are prominent in Ireland, are typically hawthorns. Other species have been associated with the fair folk as well, and there are similar stories told around the world. But in Ireland, it's typically hawthorn, and the most famous of which is on the way to Galway. It's a bush called the Latoon fairy tree. It sits on the side of the highway, seemingly no different than any other plant. But in the 90s, construction for the highway changed course as a local folklorist advocated for its protection. The owner of the land had seen a substance that indicated fairy involvement, and frankly, it wasn't worth the risk. They warned the construction company that messing with this tree could cause accidents or even fatalities on the highway. Eventually, the tree was left alone, the highway plan shifted, and it's still there to this day. These stories are not rare. I also found an article about a Neolithic excavation site in the late 90s, early 2000s, where they left a single tree that the landowner warned was a fairy tree. There's even a rumor that destroying a hawthorn tree was what caused the DeLorean car manufacturer and the founder himself to go bankrupt. There are more than 100 supposed locations in Ireland alone that the locals swear are fairy trees. But as I said, they're not only in Ireland. One of the most interesting stories I found was that of Joan of Arc. Though we often hear about her clothing coming up in trial, Meltzer reminds us that her association with a fairy tree was also a hot topic. In her hometown, a local beech tree was part of numerous rituals performed by local girls and women, where they would place offerings on the tree. It doesn't have to be a hawthorn tree in Ireland or a rock in Iceland to be an in-between place, or even that of mystical properties. We see this all the time in literature. Trees often represent something more than nature. They may be a figure or a creature themselves, like Daphne in Greek mythology, or the Ents from Lord of the Rings. They could be a door to another world, like fairy trees. They could represent a deity or have a sacred connection to them. An article on the significance of trees in literature reads, "Fortunately, fantasy fiction, the heir to the tradition of myths and fairy tales, may still remind us about the spiritual value of nature." In the Overstory, Powers writes one of, the longest, but also most beautiful books I've ever read that follows the lives of several protagonists and how their connection to trees altered the very course of their existence. The book isn't fantasy or magic realism, but instead an understanding of the rooted interconnectedness of nature and those of us who interact with it. Another article writes, "The cult of sacred trees is virtually universal." And I agree. We see this not only in Ireland, but around the world. And not many are exempt from these rituals. Those who feel they are, I can't help but wonder if they've ever decorated a Christmas tree.